Busy.
So, welcome to Pub in the Desert, where we bring you honest, curious conversations about faith and the human experience. I'm Matthias Miller here with my co host, Kevin David Critner, and we've got some awesome guests that I can't wait to introduce you to in just a minute. But before we do that, I want to recap our three guiding principles here. First, you don't need to be fixed, you need to be known. And we believe that love is knowing and being known. Second, we approach difficult topics with genuine curiosity. We're not here to win arguments, but we're here to understand. And third, we don't come with preset agendas. We are here to let conversations unfold naturally and follow where authenticity leads us. So pull up a chair, grab a drink, and let's explore what union looks like with God, with others, and with ourselves. And so today we've got Pat and Caitlin Lapp here with us. And I just want to kick off a little bit with, for our listeners who don't know who you are, do you want to start us off a little bit and share a little bit about yourself, Pat?
Yeah, for sure. My wife Caitlin is taking care of our two kids. We have two kids. And they're just
Awesome.
about to go to sleep. So we're just putting the finishing touches on bedtime routine. My name's Patrick. I grew up in Delaware. Youngest of a big family, kind of came to the faith early in life. Kind of had that Christian journey all throughout my early years. Really took my faith seriously, and going into my teenage years, really just felt God's call to the ministry. Began to read a lot of literature at that point. Went to Moody Bible Institute in Spokane back when it was still open. That extension campus was still open. Studied biblical exposition and preaching. Really fell in love with the early church at that point too. I was in the Ancient Christian Studies honors program, and then through the early church, that began my love of historical theology and studying the history of the church and the history of theology and how. What really captivated me was reading Augustine, reading Gregory, reading Aquinas, and them pinpointing the human experience, the Christian experience for me in ways that I had never heard. And these were, thousands, hundreds of years ago, 1,000 years ago. And they were accurately pinpointing my own Christian experience and walk. And so I knew there was something there that I fell in love with. And so that continued and kind of pushed me and kind of led me into the spiritual formation program at Talbot University or Talbot School of Theology in California. And that spiritual formation journey was very heavily focused on early church figures, as well as through the different traditions of the history of the church, the Carmelite tradition. And so that just kind of carried that on. And so through that, I was trained as a spiritual director, as well as that was my Master's of Divinity degree, so for pastoral studies as well. And then started serving at a church in LA, and then my wife and I, we just moved up to Washington in January. Started at a new church. I'm the pastor of youth and family, and I get to do a little bit of spiritual direction on the side as that kind of gets going in a new location. And it's great because I met my wife here in Washington, and so we kind of have a special place. Washington has a special place in our hearts, so we were very happy to return and kind of be here and kind of settling in here.
Awesome.
Awesome. And Kate, love to hear a little bit from you as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So I grew up in Ohio and spent most of my life there, moved out for Moody Bible Institute as well. And, just really loved missions. And I had a desire to go and do missions eventually and wasn't sure exactly how it would all play out. But while I was there, just had some really solid professors and leaders that kind of helped guide me a little bit and kind of, missions doesn't always look like going overseas, it can look like a lot of things, right? And so it was, really good talk to have that at that age. And I had always loved apologetics and philosophy and was just really fascinated with, I think, deeper questions and, wanting to know a little bit about like, okay, well, why are we here? What is our purpose? What does that look like? What is truth? And all those things of like, I just had a lot of questions and I really loved the people who had those similar questions. So thought, after graduating, it was kind of like, well, I don't have any specific plans. I wasn't dating anyone at the time. So I decided to stay in Spokane. And at that point, I was encouraged by somebody else to look into like, okay, maybe you should go get a master's either in apologetics or philosophy. and just see where that takes you. And especially while you were just waiting. So I started looking into programs, and then I started dating Patrick. And he had, he had these plans of like, I want to go to this school and I kind of want to do this spiritual formation, whatever. And I looked at the school and they're like one of the top in the country for their philosophy program. So I was like, great, okay, well, yeah, let's do this. So so we got married, moved down, and he started his program. And then about 6 months later, unexpectedly, I found that I was able to start. And so, yeah, just we both ended up attending at the same time. And we got a really good, close group of friends from the philosophy program that we're still in contact with. And they love asking the same questions. And it was really just an eye opener for like, I really love learning how to think and how to ask better questions of those that also want to think and ask questions. And so it's like maybe this is part of my reason purpose. I had always struggled a lot growing up with just maybe a lot of identity questions, and maybe not feeling very loved or whatever, and just struggled with some suicidal thoughts in that. And so really just wanted to be able to be there for people who had questions that they didn't know how to answer, and possibly give them maybe a little bit of a bridge to God of saying like, okay, well, you have these questions, like, how do we think about it? Like where do we start? And maybe taking away some of those boundaries and barriers that are keeping you from wanting to accept God as a possibility, right? And so, yeah, and really, yeah, admire the program for that. And I felt like it gave me good direction. So yeah, now we're in Washington and doing life here, and yeah, just having a good time trying to figure out, next steps of, just doing ministry together, but also I'm staying at home with the kids, and looking at, possibly writing a book and that to kind of talk about a fantasy fiction of a journey to faith for the kids, and giving them a kind of like something fun to be able to talk through their life and their struggles, and to have kind of an opening for those kinds of discussions with them in a fun and lighthearted way. So, yeah.
Wow. Wow. So many different directions to go here.
Yeah.
What I want to know about first is tell me about your kids.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So our oldest is 3.5. I'm gonna be 4 in February. She's very smart, very articulate, very much a leader, very much a debater. She's very good already at trying to get concessions made and get her way in very convincing ways. She's very smart. She's very
The
good.
negotiator, huh?
Oh,
Very
yeah.
negotiating. Yeah. Our son is the vocal one. He's actually the one you can hear. He's a year almost 2. But yeah, he's got a lot of passion.
Love it.
I love his little, he has a lot of drive, a lot of passion. He feels things very deeply. He has 1s and 10s the whole day, just 1s and 10s, and I love it.
Wow.
I'm here for it. He's yeah.
All right. That's awesome. Wow. The first question that comes to mind, living in Delaware, faith from the beginning, kind of thing. How would you characterize your early faith experience? What did that look like for you?
Yeah. So I think for me, it was very heavily based on guilt and shame, kind of in that kind of revivalistic culture where hell is presented first as kind of the main reason one would even consider going to God. And so really, the moment I came to faith at age 6, I remember having a very conscious awareness of, oh, I need to pray this prayer quick, because if Jesus comes back in the next hour, I'm doomed because I didn't make it
I'm in
in.
trouble.
Yeah, right. So there's this very real awareness. And I even remember early on praying prayers of confession for sins that I had done. And in my mind, having this kind of twisting of God's arm, like, oh, well, Jesus died for me. So God, you have to forgive me for my sins.
Right.
Like there was this kind of like, oh, I felt like God was kind of bummed out that like he had to forgive me. Like, oh man, I slipped away.
Right.
So that began to
So
develop.
the apple doesn't fall far from the tree as far as the negotiation goes.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. No. Yeah. there's a thing parents say, right, to their kids. They're like, "Oh, I hope you have a kid that one day does X
Right.
for you." And my mom has said that to me many times. And yeah, the
Yep.
fulfillment of her wish is here. So yeah,
It happened.
definitely.
Beware the prayers of the mother.
Yeah, that's right. That's powerful,
Yeah.
effective, very effective. Yeah. So yeah, really coming to know the love of Christ was real, was a real turning point for me of like, oh no, there's this kind of real searching of love that is taking place. And that really culminated in it, even in college with, Psalm 139 of the pursuit of God, feeling very much afraid of that psalm for quite a while. And then that paired with this wonderful poem by Francis Thompson, The Hound of Heaven, just to
Yep.
picture Christ as the hound.
Wonderful.
Just fantastic poem. And so that those two things kind of really begin to break down those walls of God's love is here in my darkness, in my weakest points. He loves me there. And to not run away from that. That was probably the real turning point. Yeah.
Wow. I was thinking yesterday. I was reading in I think it's in John, the parable Jesus tells about the unjust judge and the
Yeah.
woman who badgers him and badgers him and badgers him, and finally he's like, just leave me alone. I'll give you whatever you want.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about, like, typically we think of that in terms of persistence, right? Persistence in prayer. But I was thinking about, what if we flipped it around? What if God is the persistent one?
Mhm.
His love is so utterly persistent that until we're broken down, like the judge is broken down eventually, and we
Yeah.
recognize the justness of his cause.
Right.
Right.
I was thinking, it made me think of that when you were talking about, the Hound of Heaven in Psalm 139, like to flip that around and go, maybe that's the case.
Yeah, getting us to a point of coming to the end of ourselves, right? And like realizing, do I want to make this choice or not? Like,
Right. Right. And we talk a lot about the desert here, and the imagery throughout scripture is
Oh,
vast. Is completely and utterly vast. And I was meeting with one of my clients today, and she was talking about the desert experience, and she's like, "Well, do you ever come out of it?"
yeah.
And I was like, that is an awesome question. And what I thought was, I don't think you come out of it.
interesting.
I think you become the desert. And
Yeah.
then wherever you go, that union that happens in the desert, like Hosea's wife, lead you out into the desert to speak tenderly to you. There's a union that happens there, and you just carry that union with you wherever you go.
Mhm.
Interesting. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we were talking about this yesterday. I couldn't remember the author, Matthias.
Yes.
It's Maya Angelou.
Angela.
Anyways, I was talking about, I had seen Brene Brown talks about, she was on the Oprah show, and Maya Angelou was a guest as well, so she's in the green room. She's talking to her about her life experiences, and Maya Angelou talks about, like, I've lived in the desert so long, I've become the desert.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
first time I read that and heard that, I was like, that mirrors my experience. That totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
So
Oh, yeah.
to just
Yeah.
throw that
Yeah.
out there, do with
Yeah.
it what you
Yeah.
will.
No, I love the thought of becoming the desert. It seems like for many we have an understanding of flourishing, like we're in the desert but we're on the brink. Oh, if I could just change this about my life, if I could just do this, if I could just get this prayer answered, if I could just overcome this character flaw, I'd be in the oasis, I'd be in the flourishing. So it's interesting
Right.
to think of what does it mean to just kind of settle into the desert and reside with God in the desert, and allow him to,
Meet us where we're at.
yeah, meet us where you're at, kind of allow him to, yeah. And maybe a question based on what you kind of just shared is, what then does flourishing look like in the desert?
It's a brilliant question, right? Like, from our context, you grew up in Delaware, you're in Washington, I'm Southern California, Colorado, like all these things. For me, when I picture Psalm 23, you lay me down beside the still waters in this lush field of grass. Like, have you ever been to the area or seen pictures of it where the guy who wrote that is living?
Interesting. Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
There's no flourishing grass fields everywhere.
Yeah, right, yeah. It's not the hillsides of Pennsylvania or like
Right.
yeah.
I'm thinking it almost reminds me of the manna in the desert.
Mhm.
Right, right.
Like to live in the desert, it's just enough.
Sure, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And you have to rely on God to provide those things for you.
right, yeah, yeah,
When a lot of the suffering that we experience is because of the it should be different. Like if only,
yeah,
like Patrick, you mentioned this, like we if only the circumstance would change, then I'd be okay. But part of Jesus' call to lay down worry was really, in some sense, to settle into the desert. And Paul talks about finding contentment there. And it's kind of weird that it's weird, but not weird. It makes sense. Like as you settle into contentment and trust, you find the oasis in the desert, you find the union.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And it's very countercultural, especially for our movement today, because today the basis of every advertisement on TV is you're uncomfortable. You shouldn't be. Here's something that'll help you not be. And so
Right.
uncomfortableness is seen as one of the problems. And I think even in the
Mm.
Christian church, you can see a stream of a Christian movement that has really bought into this, not just with money. We think of like the prosperity gospel, not just with money, but there's a prosperity of spirituality gospel where it says, oh, even though I might not be rich or healthy, but my life will look like I'll look a certain way because I'm saved and because I'm spiritual and that sort of thing. Whereas I don't really see that in the history of the church at all. Even thinking back to when the big shift in Christian persecution after Constantine, um, the kind of uh, discomfort that arose in the church because they weren't being persecuted, and they were like, "Well,
Right.
how do we follow Jesus when we're not persecuted?" They actually had no real conception of what that would look like because they're like, comfort is the enemy in that situation. I mean, the rich man is it's hard for the rich man to get into heaven for a reason. And so they
Right.
began. I don't know if you heard the term red martyr versus white martyr.
Yep.
The red martyr, the blood martyrs of the church giving their blood, the white martyrs who decided to intentionally find discomfort in order to grow in their Christian faith because they knew comfort was one of the main enemies.
Well, that's the whole desert father and mother movement, right? Like here, it's just so comfortable and it's a salt to the senses and that kind of stuff. We got to go out somewhere where we can find some solitude.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and find some like it's hard to say real physical battle, but it's more of like a spiritual battle. I mean, but it's like a tangible spiritual battle. Because
Yeah.
waking up in comfort is a battle. It's a cross to bear. One of my favorite authors, Fenelon, talks about the different kinds of crosses, and some are made of rough wood and stone, and some are made of like gold and silver, but they crucify nonetheless. And so, yeah, there is a cross of comfort that we have to bear in resisting temptation. But I think some of these men and women went out to the desert and found very raw, real, tangible battles to fight. So I'm talking about
Right.
experiences with demonic activity and trying to like, yeah,
Right.
struggle through temptation and real harsh reality, that brought them to a place of spiritual sanctification that allowed them to speak words of wisdom and become leaders.
Yeah.
Right. That
Well,
fostered that union, it seems like,
yeah.
in a way,
Yeah.
in a way that no other way could have accomplished.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. I think it, this is like one of my favorite topics is the topic of suffering. And I think it's interesting because like our natural gut reaction is to say that pain is evil.
Mm.
And I think
Right.
maybe suffering is evil, but there's a distinction between the pain and
Mm.
suffering. And so I
Mm.
think pain is not inherently evil because it does a lot to indicate to us that something isn't the way
Mm.
it should be. Right. And
Right.
whether it's physical, emotional, or spiritual,
Mm.
whenever we're experiencing a sort of pain, it's letting us know that, hey,
Mm.
something's off. We need to fix this or look, pay attention to it, just, you know,
Right.
give it heed and see how we can work this out so that this is no longer doing this, right? And so
Mm.
I think that is actually a really good thing for people that we don't like, because it's uncomfortable. It's not something we really want to feel 24/7, but it lets us know the system is malfunctioning, and how do we get the system back on track, right? And so it's our indicator.
Or or the system is functioning exactly how it was designed to. We're just ignoring it.
Right.
This
Yes.
is the problem
Yes.
with comfort.
And
Yeah.
needing to point us to something greater than ourselves, right? Like,
And
yeah.
that's what addiction is, right? The symptom or the system is functioning as it should. We just don't want to hear it.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
And
Right.
so I numb it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I listened to this rabbi, and he talked about this. He said addiction, you think is addiction is the problem. Addiction's actually the solution.
Right.
It's an attempted solution for something.
Yeah.
It's a poor solution.
Right.
Yeah. Really bad.
Yeah, but it's a solution. Like
Mhm.
the key is understanding it. And it made me think when you were talking, the red martyrs, there is obviously physical threat that is going on. You have to go underground.
Mhm.
And then when you no longer, after Constantine, you no longer have to go underground. Now you can be out in the open. Is it a human trait? And I want to get your opinion on this. Is it a human trait to create the suffering?
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Possibly in a healthy and unhealthy way. Maybe I think it was Dostoevsky that made the comment that if the world was perfect, humans would quickly mess it up so that they could
Right.
create kind of pain or suffering for themselves. I think,
Right.
yeah, part of it is human to kind of create drama or to create some kind of threat or some kind of war or anxiety. We long for that. I think the picket lines kind of are this idea of us kind of wanting to have a cause to fight for something.
Yes.
And I think so part of that's maybe even God given. But I think, yeah, I think there is some needed anxiety in terms of, oh, why is it that the rich man is it's so hard for the rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven? I think there's that question should be on our minds, especially anyone who lives in a culture that's very, very affluent and wealthy. Even for those who are low or medium income, are still, by the world standards or historical standards, extremely wealthy. So I think
Right.
it's a very important question. I also it's interesting as you kind of read through the church that many times in the persecuted countries or the persecuted eras, there's really no talk of dark night of the soul, no talk of a desert of experience, right? But only
Hmm.
the more kind of comfortable times where Christianity accepted, that's where the dark night of the soul really kind of comes out. People start writing about these experiences of kind of feeling as if they lost the experience of God's presence, in a very theological way. They didn't lose God's presence. They know this
Of
from,
course not. Yeah.
but the experience of God's presence, they tend to lose those experiences, and that draws them into a desert experience that allows them to grow in sanctification. But
Yeah.
uniquely those cultures that aren't being physically persecuted.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even the coiner of the term "Dark Night of the Soul," Saint John of the Cross, like he's living in an environment that is affluent, and he escapes it
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
and experiences this and writes about it and those kinds of things. And so it's like,
Yeah.
to your
And
point.
and both him and Teresa of Avila would have went through extreme physical pain in terms of sickness, especially John, as he was one time he was in prison at some point,
Yep.
um, post writing, but maybe not. I could be misremembering that, but both of them went through immense physical pain as well that attributed to their understanding of God and sanctification. But yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, that kind of it was in that Catholic Spain that kind of those direct writings begin to come, although it's been referenced other places. But yeah.
So I'm
Yeah, of course.
fascinated by this idea because it's masterful deception to flip from the enemy being comfort to the enemy being discomfort. That's really, really masterful deception. And second of all, with this whole idea that we were made for difficulty in some capacity, I mean, it's really fascinating that in the personal development space, people talk so heavily about self-sabotage. which is exactly the act of introducing, at least by one definition, introducing difficulty amidst to prevent ease.
Yeah.
Just take it where you will.
Yeah. So, let me, if I can clarify that, are you saying that the thought is that they introduce the self-sabotage to kind of create the difficulty, or is the self-sabotage the lack of difficulty?
So self-sabotage is seen as the enemy. So when you become when things become easy, or if there's an easy path, you'll introduce difficulty into the path to instinctively avoid ease, even though that's not what you want, but it
Yeah.
becomes the enemy. So just simple story. You might be on the verge of pick a salesperson closing a really big deal, and it's just too easy. You just have to go in and close it. Just get them to sign the papers, and you oversleep your alarm, and you come up with a big excuse, and you get a knot in your
Right.
stomach, and you completely botch the deal for there's no reason why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unless
And
it's a spiritual, like
Sure.
it's like
Yeah.
built in for God to kind
Yeah.
of navigate us back to him, right? Like if,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
apathetic, like I think because comfort is not necessarily the evil or the work of the devil's playground type thing as much as apathy. Like, and that's where
Sure.
comfort leads us,
Right.
right? Is to
Is the
apathy,
danger.
to contentedness.
Right.
And especially if it's a contentedness without
Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
So like that is where
Yeah.
the issue is. So it's not necessarily the comfort. It's not necessarily, it's that apathetic nature of like, yeah, well, whatever, because it's the lukewarm, right? It's all those things. And so, and I think like it makes it, my mind just keeps going through as we're talking of like we're depicted as like the sheep, right? And he's the great shepherd. And sheep have a lot of issues. Like they run into a lot of problems. They get themselves into all these issues that happen. They really, like, if they're left to their own devices, their wool gets too heavy for them to bear and like becomes more of a problem for them. They can really struggle to move around and get places because of it. They, fall and get lost, like all these things where it's the self-sabotage type, like it's
Yeah.
an innate thing that happens to them. And I feel like from a spiritual sense, it almost makes a lot of sense for humans to also have that same kind of built-in navigation of back. Like if we didn't have trials and if we didn't have struggles, would we easily just be content then? If there wasn't something
Right.
about ourselves that constantly kind of
Yeah.
needed us to find greater help, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, I think the hardest part is I think there's two different levels to this, because if you're trying to find shalom without God,
Mhm.
you're going to fail. And that's where the self-sabotage comes in. You're going to eventually self-sabotage whatever your sense of shalom is. Although I would say I really kind of fall into the camp, if you will, of kind of Aristotle's idea of everyone's doing everything for their own happiness. No one does anything other than what they think will make them happy. And so even self-sabotage in my mind fits in that model of, in some way, they believe self-sabotage will bring about some kind of happiness. Even if it's unconsciously that they think that.
because I think they're fixing a problem for themselves that
Maybe,
like you said, they think it's going to be too easy. There's something up, whatever. So
yeah, there's a piece of, so I'm reading right now a book on self-harm through Augustine's theology of atonement and the incarnation. It's very interesting how for Augustine there's this real hard piece of, we try to center ourselves, and that actually ends up being where we find ourselves harming ourselves,
Yeah.
both physically and then even self-sabotage in that way. And his whole thing is that as you begin to self-center yourself, you begin to cut off community, all the while trying to set up yourself as God. Try to cut off community. You isolate yourself so that then you're free. There's all of these pieces where you can find yourself moving into this place that then leads you into self-sabotage. And then where the self-harm comes in, it would take place when you are seeking to confirm that which you begin to believe about yourself, that you're unworthy, unwanted. And so then you are acting in ways
Yeah.
to confirm that lie about yourself. So even self-sabotage,
Confirmation bias.
confirmation bias. Even the seller who's making this easy sale, maybe he has this or she has this what is the imposter syndrome, right? Where they don't really think they're good enough. And so
Yeah.
there's a piece of them that if they self-sabotage, then it helps prove that they're not good enough. But if they make the sale, the next sale, all the more pressure because then
Right.
they have to keep up this facade in their minds of being a good salesperson. And so I think
Right.
some of the self-sabotage comes from a little bit of that self-harm when you kind of center yourself in this prideful way and then
What, as you were talking, I was thinking, like, the self-realization, that process that's going on. Would you consider that a form of perfectionism?
interesting. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, could be.
Because the outcome of every perfectionistic that I'm aware of, I could be wrong on this, every perfectionistic endeavor ends in self-loathing.
Yeah. Mhm.
Because what I think is, and certainly not the first one to say this, I think the first one I heard talk about this was Brennan Manning in A Glimpse of Jesus. And he said, with perfectionism, at some point you try and you try and you try to be perfect, and sometimes you become really aware that I can't be.
Yeah.
And instead of acknowledging the standard was inappropriate, you
Right.
blame yourself for not being able to be that.
Sure.
So I was wondering if you see that in that process you were talking about,
Yeah.
leading to self-harm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a sense in which um especially for the perfectionists, self-harm, whether that be emotional flagellation or physical of some kind,
Hmm.
or it can come out through eating, through other addictions, whatever it may be, usually is seen as kind of a punishment and then feeling some release because you think you deserve punishment, you get punishment that somehow makes you feel some relief, at least in the moment. Um,
Right.
yeah, so I think you're right. I think perfectionism can play a part into that process because we all want to be perfect, right? That's Adam and Eve in the garden, right? Like, don't you want to be like God, to know good and evil? Like, we want to be God, we want to be perfect, and we
Right.
can't. And so when we fail, then yeah, that's where the self-harm and the kind of destructive patterns really emerge.
Yeah. And there's this fascinating point that I thought of, like, as you're talking, like, when that realization occurs, like, I'm not God, I can't be perfect. Instead of communicating that, talking about it, being open about it, I pretend like it's not there. I
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
sow- I sow the fig leaves and I hide behind the bushes, and when I'm confronted on it, it was the snake. The snake made me do it, or it was either you, God, or her, because
Yeah,
it
yeah,
certainly wasn't me.
yeah, you're right. Yeah,
Like
yeah,
human nature on a very basic level. And I
yeah,
think, like you said, you're talking about Augustine is talking about, or Aristotle is saying we're all pursuing happiness. I mean, at least from that story, what I hear from the garden, from the fall, I hear we just don't want to be alone. We're so
mm,
deathly afraid of being alone because of that separation that occurred.
yeah.
We're so deathly of being afraid alone, we will do anything to not be alone.
Right, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the irony is that the more you try to not be alone, the more well, sorry, the more you fear not being alone, the more you isolate.
Right.
And so then you actually make yourself more alone. And so you think of
Yeah.
even the garden, they hid from God. Their greatest relationship, their source of greatest things. What was the quote from the book that you just had in the last few pages?
Oh,
The fear,
I
something
uh
about fear making the fear become a
oh
reality.
yeah, don't allow your fear to make the choice for you.
Oh, right. Don't allow the fear to make the choice for you. So it's like the
Right.
fear of being alone makes the choice for you to be alone.
Well, in a very scriptural way, you become what you behold.
Right. Oh,
Mhm.
that's a good, yeah,
Yeah.
sure do.
Or
Yeah.
you think about it this way. Sorry, I'm running here. My mind's going a
Oh,
thousand
this is
different
great. This
ways.
is how my brain works too. So we're just
Right,
following
right.
the leaves wherever
So
they go. Yeah, yeah.
you're looking at in Numbers where the poisonous snakes come into the camp.
Mm.
And Moses goes into the tabernacle. He's like, God, what do I do? And God says, hey, make a bronze snake, put it on a pole, put it up in front of the congregation. What? Create an idol? What? What I hear him saying there is they have to cast their eyes upon their greatest fear to face it, to be in the presence of it. And then Jesus references it in John, I will be lifted up on a pole.
Yeah.
And then many, I'm not the first one who said this, I've heard this many times, but Jesus in that Passion Week experiences every last human fear that you can experience.
Mm.
So the example is cast your eyes on me. You will cast your eyes on me and you will come face to face with your fears. And in that point, you'll become stronger. But if you do, to your point, if you do that aside from God,
Sure.
aside from shalom,
Yeah.
then you just become a function of your fears.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You end up falling into the well. I think that was John Coe at Talbot. He's the leader of the spiritual formation program. He used to talk about that. If you look into the well of your soul without Jesus, you fall in, right? And
Yep.
like because you just get taken over by the darkness and the dysfunction, the brokenness that's there. There's no way to actually maintain distance and find healing. There's just falling in, just nihilism. Basically, you just kind of give up.
Yeah. It becomes nihilistic.
Yeah, which is logically sound. I think that's one of the things I appreciate about Nietzsche is that he at least consistent. At least he's
It's
consistent.
consistent.
Yeah, it's dark, but yeah.
Yeah. It truly is. I mean, he went off the rails in a lot of different areas, but that kind of happens when you have syphilis, you know.
Yeah, there was a lot of problems. Again, the consistency of a worldview. Um,
Yeah.
you know.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me that we talk about self-actualization and how it isolates. And I mean, it's fascinating to me how you can also have a tribe of people who are self-actualizing, which is a really ironic twist on community because effectively you then share you build some kind of shared ego that we all participate in, and we isolate inside the group, we isolate as a group, and we're attempting to somehow harness what comes through community and through relationship. But again, we fall short of shalom.
Utterly closed off from anything around you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a name for a group like that, right? If I'm not wrong. It's called a cult.
it's called a cult.
I think so. Yeah, it's a good definition actually. The group self-actualization. I think that's a definition for a cult that I hadn't heard before. Um, but that's an interesting way to conceptualize it. What I appreciate about that definition is that it reveals the very true nature of what they're twisting,
Yeah.
because truly community does bring a spirit of unity, a spirit of strength, courage, celebration of oneself and one's identity. And that's what we're looking for. And that's why cults are so powerful. And then why they bring people in is because they
They
offer,
promise an identity.
yeah, they promise you some kind of shadow of the truth that you can then experience in small pieces that then has you hooked. Which I think is
Right.
what evil truly tries to do. It's yeah, piggyback on the good. Yeah, that's what evil does.
So,
Yeah, it's
and
just a slight adulteration or a slight impurity within the good, and the enemy is very subtle,
Mhm.
and he's
but if you look
really
at this
good at it.
strictly as binary, zero to one, cult, not a cult, then sure, that's easy. But somewhere there is a tipping point at which a group of people moves predominantly from a community to a cult. And I'm curious what stirs in the hearts of people, the leader, the whoever it is, to start first drifting in that direction, and what is it that pushes it over the tipping point?
That's a great question.
Great question. Yeah.
I think some of it can be explained by what you talked about in your sermon, as far as like having a deep fear of God, first of all, loving us
Sure.
in our mess, right?
Right,
Like
right.
that being the great
Mm.
fear. And
Yeah.
then the same thing for people, right? When we're supposed to find
Right.
close community
Yeah.
and to share our burdens with one another, right? To, confess to some level of
Right.
whatever, like, and having them still supposed to love us and still supposed to accept us with all that entails, like, to the depravity that we have, like,
Right.
but we're supposed to be open and okay with it and to not assume that it's gonna cause harm or havoc in our relation, like
Sure.
we have to be able to forgive one another for it, right? And like that is daunting, and
Right,
it's
right.
daunting with God, who is perfect and I know loves me
Yeah.
perfectly. I can't imagine doing that in community, right? And
Yeah.
so at some level, there's certain community standards to be upheld, whether it's a
Right.
moral code or a certain kind of like look to the the group of like, this is how you have to behave or conduct yourself, whatever, this is what you need to think, this is all of those things, and you realize you fall short, or there's something wrong with you that maybe everyone else has gotten it perfectly and it seems like they're all fine with it, they're all doing okay, everyone else in this cult doesn't seem to have a problem with it,
Yeah.
you're not thinking of a cult necessarily, but like everyone else in this group seems to be upholding the standard and has no issue with it, they can do their part. Why am I the only one that seems to struggle with this? But you can't voice that, because if you do, you out yourself. And will they still accept? Right. And so I think it's that kind of
fear.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and what you're describing is kind of the name and mentality, because the weakness of the cross is so subversive to our natural way of thinking, right? Because even when Naaman turns away and says, "No, I'm not going to go do this weird task," the servant is like, "Well, wouldn't you climb a mountain, fight an army?" And he's like, "Well, yeah, but you're not going to do the simple task." And I think a cult, one of the ways that the cult begins to transform is it starts to set up humanly achievable goals that you can do to make yourself okay. Whereas God says, no, you can't. There is no mountain to climb. There is no great task to achieve. You have to abide. And what the heck does that mean, right? Like how do I abide without doing active, but then am I abiding because I'm acting, right? Like there's
Right.
this real kind of surrender to weakness, to yeah, to the chaos of the ocean, or it's like floating in the ocean. I've heard it described. I can't remember. I don't know if that was Teresa or someone writing on her, but they described as floating in the ocean, right? It's like, how am I supposed to surrender to the chaos and mystery of God? I'd much rather climb a mountain. It's so much more achievable than
Right.
surrendering to God.
Right. That's a powerful point.
Can we please not make this uncomfortable for me?
No, man, what's
Yeah, yeah.
what are you struggling
These
with?
discussions could quickly turn painful very, very quickly. Yeah. Yeah. I think the greatest, I get every once in a while, I'll get a few people reflecting on a sermon I preach. And one of the greatest compliments is like, I hated every minute of it. Like, thank you. Like, it's like
Right.
one of the greatest compliments. You're like, oh, yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. Because, yeah,
Right.
because for sure, it's not easy to preach these things either. Because, yeah, I have to sit with them for weeks before.
Well,
Right.
there's so much smugness and self-righteousness that I mean, I, it's easy not to think of it as a problem that you're not self-disclosing what you're struggling with. Like, I that's not the issue, but the way that you're laying it out, and like it's very clear, like that actually is the issue. The hiding, the all of that stuff. That's I by doing that am contributing towards the movement towards becoming a cult. Now that's a fairly, I'm not saying we're becoming one, I'm not saying we're going to become one, but I'm contributing to the shift in that direction. And me choosing to disclose my own brokenness, my own shortcomings, failures, and all of that is me helping to anchor back to where we're called to be.
Right.
Yeah.
To
Well,
be
if you look at it,
Yeah.
yeah, if you look at it, you know, the theme of love within scripture is pretty apparent. I don't think there's too much debate around that. But if it is defined as knowing and being known, like Paul defines it, then the hiding, the not being able to share, the not being a safe space for each other to share, then it strikes at the very fabric of the universe. It's a disconnection from that from the beginning. And if we don't have connection to that, what do we have connection to?
Yeah.
Well, and the hardest part is realizing that even if you do your part well, if just one person in that group chooses not to do their part well, it sets you up for great hurt and
Yeah.
devastate the rest of the
Yeah.
group, right?
Yeah.
Because it taints everyone then.
Yeah.
If they, especially if they all witness it, you know, if it's
Right.
all apparent to everyone else
Yeah.
that like this person did not handle this other person's heart well,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and they laid themselves bare. They did everything that they should. They were
Right.
open, they were honest, they were contrite, they were, you know, name it. And then this person just tossed it in the dirt. And it's like that can ruin the whole group for everyone. But without being the first person to kind of step up and take that risk,
Yeah.
it risks the chance of then people being willing to start to create a group that is that, right? Like it, you know, you have to take those risks and to know
Yeah.
that even if someone lets you down, this is still how we continue community and well, and this is
Right.
still how we are to love one another as ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Like this is
Yeah.
it. And so we have to work on then forgiveness, which is another part, you know,
Right.
like reconciliation, like
All right.
all
Yeah.
those other parts that are still very clear within the Bible.
Yeah.
And so it's like this is all part of the walk. And so
Right.
we kind of have to walk knowing that it's going to happen and
Yeah.
somebody's not going to hold my heart well, but it gives me an opportunity to practice forgiveness and
Right.
reconciliation.
Right.
And it's going to be painful. It's going to be rough. It could cause long-term, you know, hardships and issues within my own heart and insecurities, but this is what I'm called to do. And when you find it and it works well, it's beautiful and it's incredible. But it comes with grace.
It does. Right.
We like to believe that risk doesn't come, that risk will always be rewarded. And I mean, this kind of goes back to the white martyr conversation. Like, if you really stare this thing down, there's this admission that this really could end very badly and I might not recover.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
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 Or those I love might not recover, right? Because
Right.
even if it doesn't hurt you directly, it could greatly hurt like
Yeah.
my husband or my kids and affect them in a way that I had no intention of drawing them into, but for some reason it did.
Yeah.
And it made them in a vulnerable spot that now
Yeah.
I'm partly responsible for it. Like,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's almost you fully expect that among the feet you wash will be Judas, right? And
Mhm.
the image of Jesus kneeling down before Judas, washing his feet, when not 6 hours later, roughly, Judas would betray him, and that image for me is this kind of this really harsh acceptance at the beginning of this movement into this self-disclosure, kind of honesty, vulnerability, is admitting to yourself that there may be a Judas of whom I'm washing their feet. And it's not about them. This act is about me serving and being obedient. And their response will be their response. And that is incredibly hard and difficult to do. But that's part of the um yeah, that's part of the agreement you're kind of making with this community, is that there's real possibility there's Judases and that we'll have to deal with that.
Right. And maybe that's the primary way to use Paul's phrase, we move from milk faith to meat faith.
Could be. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
milk is conceptual, right? Like,
Yeah.
agree conceptually with this. And I hear you say it from the stage, and it says it in the book, and I agree with it. But when the rubber meets the road, And Judas not only, walks away and betrays you, but while you're washing his feet, he kicks you.
That's
Yeah.
true. Yeah.
There's a lesson to be learned there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
And the fact to acknowledge that I've been Judas
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of
can
humility.
almost continually, if I'm honest about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then also, I think one of the fears too that I think is helpful for people to get over is that I think that it's very intentional. One of the 12 was Judas, right? And that Judas is the villain, right? Like we don't glorify Judas. He is the betrayer. And I think people are sometimes surprised at how many people are not Judas. Like they realize that, hey, this may feel a little fake. Maybe we're not a great community, but they realize once they start to that self-disclosure, once they start going that into that deeper places, they realize they have much more of a community than not. And so
Right.
I think even while accepting the risk and the factor of that people will get hurt, people will hurt, the large majority of the people go to church because they're looking for Jesus and because they're confessing, I need help. And so, yeah, a lot of it's fake, but there's a lot of realness there. And so if you find a little bit of a real community, they're going to go there with you. And not all of them will be Judases. So I think there's like kind of a trying to balance that fear too of like not everybody is going to betray you. There's going to be a lot of people who are going to go right there with you.
And it's very contagious. It's very
Yeah,
drawing
very
too when you
contagious.
find a community that knows how to serve one another well, that really prioritizes Christ in their own life first and then works outward from that. Like
Yeah.
that is something that draws others to mimic that same kind of walk, right? Like of saying, great, like I'm gonna make God first. I'm gonna prioritize being in the Word, being prayerful, and abiding in Him, and then the rest of my life will flow from that, right? And so like that, people see like, oh, hey, there's something about the way you choose to do your life that's actually working, and I find it attractive, and I want to do that too. And so then
Let's see what happens.
yeah, it just like brings in that same kind of community because for some reason, like the churches that we've been in that really seem to thrive like that, there's the majority of them are doing that and the majority of them are thriving. And so you can see like this is a church that got it. They're seeing one another and they're encouraging one another to do the same. And it's contagious. Like everyone's got that bug, right? And then you find other churches where it's like, ooh, someone's not found that yet. Like I've got to be the one to try and, be that person, whatever. And then like it draws other people too, like so it's like it's something that can spread greatly, but it is it's risky, it's scary, you hate to have to
Right.
be the one to bring it, right? Like
Yeah.
so
First one's always hard. Yeah. Yeah.
It's so much easier to develop a group identity around victimization
yes.
and self-protection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Sure.
the around the vulnerability and the honesty and this is who I am and that kind of thing, that's really scary and that's really hard. The easier one is we all have a common enemy.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we gather in this group around this common enemy, whether it's the world or it's this politician or whatever it is, this
Yeah.
person, this individual. We love scapegoating.
Yeah.
Yes.
All the time. Yeah. Yeah.
And a false sense of community through that, right? Like
Yeah.
it's like, oh, we all agree on this. We
Yeah.
are all, one-minded on this particular thing, but no one's really sharing who they are with one another. It's
Right.
you go in, you get out, and it's like, yeah, we maybe do a Bible study here, but like no one's really being vulnerable with what they're going through, what they're walking through, and
Yeah.
why they're going through the desert, right? Or like experiencing that. Everyone wants to say, like, no, we're good. Me and God are awesome. It's going well. And that's
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And if
Which
you
touches,
do have somebody who's in the midst of the desert and well, like to me, the experience in the desert looks like this, and I want your guys' opinion on this. When Jesus talks about losing your life in order to find it, that kind of thing. The word life there that's translated life in our translations is actually the Greek word psyche, which means the entire person, mind, body, spirit, the entirety of it. He's like, you have to lose this
Mm. Mhm.
And that is a painful thing.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
mean everything that I've built up to protect myself and justify myself and make myself worthy and valuable in this world, you're telling me I have to lose that?
Right.
And the psychologist Carl Jung said, like, you have to lose your mind in order to get to health.
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, same kind of concept, right? I think he's echoing Jesus there.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And Paul in Romans 7, I know the right thing. I want to do the right thing. I just can't do it. Oh,
Yeah.
wretched man am I.
Yeah.
But it's almost like a gasp. It's almost like a cry at the end. Thank God for Jesus.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank God. Thank you. Like the destroyer of the ego, of the false self, of the psyche. Like, thank you for that. Because otherwise, I'd be in this cycle of shame and sin and shame and sin. And like, he's the only way I'm going to break free of it. But you, like, John 8:32, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. But it doesn't tell you what happens in between those two. You're going to experience a lot of emotions in the middle there.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Giving up lies is not a painless process. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
No,
Sure. Yeah.
So
especially if your house is built on it.
Foundation. Yeah.
I think it's fascinating here. Caitlin, you touched on this a little bit. I came across an essay recently by somebody, and I can't find it, but it was talking about the shift in worship from uh, in Western worship from the concept of God being the victor, Christ being the victor over sin and death, to us being the victors. And the idea of being winners is also a barrier to vulnerability. So it's not just being a victim, it's also being a winner, which means that like part of this thing that happens is the winning and losing. As soon as winning and losing enters the language, you lose vulnerability. And and it's like you have to completely annihilate that the fact that we're competing and that we're winning or losing. And you have to come back in some sense that like the admission is that I am not the winner. Christ is the one who defeats sin and death, not me. Uh,
Right.
Yeah. His battle was won. And here I am
Over.
just living in the glory of it and trying to draw close to him now.
Right.
Right? Like it's done and I have to accept that it's done and I'm not earning it. I'm not paying him back for it. I'm not whatever. It's how do I then learn to be more like him? And so
Yeah.
it's like that sanctification needs to look a lot different in our minds because I think we still have that mentality of
Right.
like winning or failing and whatever. And it's like that's no
Well,
longer
you look at winning, losing, failing. These are all subjective realities, right?
yeah.
Introduced after the fall.
Hmm.
Before there was, the rabbis teach before the fall, it was true and false.
Mm.
Who God is, what he said was true. Everything else was false. The second the fall happens, now all of a sudden it's good, bad, it's healthy, it's unhealthy, it's right, it's wrong, it's winning, losing. It's all subjective realities.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to follow the biblical interpretation stream along with the worship stream because even
Mm.
the way it's moved away from um even diversifying, it was heavily diversified in the history of the church, but one major piece was the Christological interpretation of the Old Testament, where Christ was the hero and seen throughout the whole Bible as the hero. And that very quickly became, I am David, the famous pastor, right, line of, right, what's your Goliath this week that God is going to help you slay, right? But you know that story is not meant like, no, Jesus is David. We're the Israelites cowering in fear. Jesus, the supposed underdog, wins this massive victory, and then we just run after the enemy and chase them away. Like we participate in the victory, but only in a very minor role that is just simply walking in the victory of another. But I think
Right.
really we've moved this whole theme in worship, and then also I think in the Bible too, where it's no, I am the conqueror. I am David. I am Moses. I am Abraham, and I am winning these battles. When the whole
I've got to
truth of the
defeat
Old
my
Testament,
sin. I've got to
defeat my sin, I got to
my
overcome.
issues, and
I have to, become sanctified so that I can have a powerful testimony, whatever it may be. It's like we have all of these thoughts of, again, those categories of winning and losing, that then really harm us in trying to surrender and to lean on Christ's victory.
Right.
The sobering thing here, I'm reflecting back in times in my life where I was like, I am pointing people to Jesus. Like, this must be amazing. And I'm sitting here and thinking about how little self-disclosure I did contrasting myself with Christ. And like part of the gift of confession is that it helps keep us away from the center of the conversation and
Mhm.
allows him to have his rightful place. And not only for our own sake, but for other people's sake. Kevin and I have had conversations about how we put people on pedestals, and confession and honesty about our humanity is like it. You were talking earlier, Patrick, about the self-centering. I mean, that's directly ties in what you're describing as far as how we've come to look at scripture.
Yeah. 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 What I think I find most difficult is that a leader who fully self-discloses, there seems to be boundaries somewhere in scripture of leaders self-disclosing. There's a really interesting psalm, and I can't remember the exact one. It's one of Asaph's psalms. He talks about how his struggle, again, this is more depicting his own experience, so I don't know if we can talk about the implications. His struggle was, he saw the success of the wicked, and how he was frustrated with this with God. He's like, I can't bring this to the congregation, right? I can't go to the temple and just
Right.
this, but he takes it to God and there finds some answer and comfort. That is, he meets God in prayer, and that is his answer, ultimately. But there's a sense of which self-disclosure, it can happen from leadership, and it should, especially if you think of those people on pedestals. That's where it
Mhm.
gets really corrupted. But in my mind, the most effective is when it's coming from the root, from the group, and the leader should participate in that. But it's very hard for a leader to get up fully self-disclose as the first, because the people will reject most times, right? Because
Mhm.
the culture is not there for them to accept the leader. Now, the leader could try to shift the culture dramatically by self-disclosing more, but really it's about building a community that self-discloses, that then allows the leader freedom to self-disclose as well. Now, that could
Right.
be backwards or wrong. It's not ideal. But in my mind, I do have some compassion for, someone with millions of subscribers who is struggling with
Yeah.
sin. They confess to their mentor, their discipler, their own pastor of pastors, but like, how do they disclose their sin in a community where there's not that built self-disclosure? And so I think that's where I think we've created a catch-22 paradox with
Right.
mega church pastors or these leaders that we put on pedestals.
Well, and I think there's an art though to also being vulnerable without being vulgar, right?
Right,
Like,
that is,
and
yeah.
so I think even when we talk about, like, people still don't know what Paul was really meaning when he was talking about the
Sure.
thorn in the flesh,
Right,
right? Like,
you're right.
but he was
No.
Yeah.
struggling with it. Here's the effects that it was having on him.
Right.
It was, here's where it took his mind, and
Yeah.
yet, like, so he was being vulnerable without divulging the
Right.
details, and that weren't
Right.
necessarily helpful, right? Like,
Sure.
if he wasn't seeking someone's individual wisdom on it, then he didn't need to say,
Sure.
here's the grossest sin that I'm struggling. Like,
Right.
no, it's not necessary. And maybe that could be more hurtful than helpful too, especially if there are others that are struggling and thinking, well, if he struggles with that, then I don't need to try so hard because like, I'm not him and I'm not, whatever. So it's like,
Right.
who knows what that could lead to. So it's like, you can still be vulnerable even if you're not sharing
Yeah.
the specifics of what it
Right.
is, right? So it's finding that that happy medium of like, I struggle and here's where it takes me. Like here's how it makes me feel, how I cry to
Yeah.
God for this. And and there's a lot that you can be vulnerable about without actually having to state like the details. So yeah.
That's fair. I like that.
It's a powerful point, Caitlin. You really like communicated that in a way I haven't heard it communicated before. Like to be vulnerable without being crass or whatever however you want to
Yeah.
characterize it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's
and God's response there too, right? My grace is sufficient for you.
Right.
What I hear there is, I'm with you in it. Do you
Right.
trust me to walk through this with you?
Right.
Man,
Yeah.
there's an inherent limitation in being a leader and an influencer, because as much as we would like to say that we hear our followers, we hear our subscribers, whatever the punchline or tagline is, Kevin, using this definition of love, knowing and being known, that there really is a very limited capacity for love in leadership, because it primarily flows in one direction. Even in terms of influence, it primarily flows in one direction. And so you can't experience true love that within that avenue. You can step down, you can step down as a leader and participate within the community, and then you have the knowing and being known. You can have smaller groups of people as an influencer within your following who do that, but to really genuinely have that with the million subscribers, it's not possible.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, Eugene Peterson is probably the most famous example of the pastor who's just like, yeah, it's too big. I can't visit
right,
a single person's house and minister to them as a shepherd. What am I doing? Right? Like
right.
I'm not able to do the work anymore. And I
Yeah,
really respect that attitude of just like, no, my goal isn't to create a 500,000 person church. Even that, I mean, and to be honest, with his capabilities and fame and fame, he could have built a mega church. But he's like, I can't even go above 500 people because yeah, I couldn't minister well. So I
yeah.
think there's
John Eldridge says quite often that he doesn't think community gatherings should be any larger than 10 to 15 people.
yeah.
And it's because in that space, each person can know each other,
Yeah.
can actually minister to and walk with and support and encourage each other.
Yeah.
But
Right.
it makes me think, you're talking about the million subscribers, the massive church, that kind of thing. Were human beings,
Mhm.
are human beings able to take that kind of position without being corrupted?
Mm.
Right. I mean, that's the question that is really harsh to answer, because I don't think anyone is equipped to handle that type of
Um,
spiritual power and influence. Um,
Well, it's
and
kind of like
the
that,
only person,
like
yeah,
of the way of the dragon, way of the lamb,
yeah.
and Kyle Strobel and Jamie.
I can't remember. I can't remember his last name.
He wrote it with one
Yeah.
of his coworkers, but yeah, they kind of go through the book of like, what does it look like to have a leader who leads well, and what does it look like for those leaders who maybe aren't leading well, and what are the signs, like what do you need to watch out for, and what do you need to also heed in your own life, be wary of, and
Yeah.
to not make those same kind of mistakes, because there's a lot of really well-known leaders who did not finish well. And
right?
where's that temptation, like what led them to get to that point? Because some and I think a lot of the times he said too, like they started so well and like had the best intentions, really wanted to do ministry according to God's way, and yet they still fell. And so
Right.
like being mindful of how to not go that same direction, like how to be a leader that is actually abiding in God, and maintaining that throughout your ministry.
Yeah.
Yeah. We all have a tendency, I believe, towards narcissistic self-protection. All of us inherently in this world. And you take somebody And then you get thousands of people needing them, wanting them, asking them questions, celebrating them.
Yeah.
It's the rich man. There's no reason to deal with your stuff. Like you're rich in money or you're rich in people and followers,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
both in that situation. It's
Yeah.
a recipe for disaster.
And then your whole energy is forced into channel into protecting your wealth, whether that's influence, whether that's
Right.
actual finances. That becomes your energy, and then that becomes your God. That
Or
becomes
or spirituality.
your
Like
spirituality.
you're the spiritual guru
So
Right.
yeah,
who that's your wealth.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
What do I have if I don't have that?
Right, right.
Right.
Yeah, who am I without this thing? That's your idol. Whatever that thing is that you say that about is your idol.
Which causes you to
Yeah.
have to withdraw
Yeah.
from community more,
course.
right?
Yep.
Because like you don't want your flaws known,
Yep.
your weaknesses out there. Like you need to preserve that and maintain that. So then you don't have community in it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're idol making machines.
Yeah.
Like we want to look at the person who fell, and I'm not saying they don't have responsibility. They certainly have responsibility. They have to own all of that. But how about the people that put them on the pedestal in the first place?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You created an idol.
Yeah.
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 And can you take responsibility for that? And I'm not taking publicly, but responsibility internally that you created this idol.
Right.
Yeah.
And when it fails them, like anyone, when our idols fail us, we get mad, we get frustrated,
Sure.
we get upset of like this should have worked out, right? And especially like when you unknowingly do it with maybe a pastor or whatever, you think like, man, they've got it together. They know, how to walk the walk and they're living according to what they're teaching. And it's like it all seems so great, which like raises that pedestal all the more. It makes them our idol all the more because it's like, man, and you don't even think about it in that sense, but you're really looking to them to kind of help you walk through this life, like to give you that wisdom, to give you that understanding, to give you that word of God that, seems to really help you with your own life. But when they fall or they admit to a weakness that you just didn't even conceive they could possibly go through, it crushes your world because then you're thinking they seem to be doing everything right and they still struggled and and it's like, yeah, because they're still human, because that is still not Christ, and Christ is the
Right.
only one that's not going to lead you down that road. Like,
Right.
it is a reality check, and it is a sadness because we want our communities to be flawless in the sense of like we want to feel like we're actually moving towards Christ well. But
Oh, it'd be wonderful.
yeah, right, it would. It
Wonderful.
feels so
think that-
wonderful. It would be so nice and so clean and happy, and yet we're all sick and we're all recovering from our sickness, and we're not gonna get ultimately well until we're in heaven, right? And so we're on this constant mend, and we're trying to encourage one another to be on the mend. And so sometimes we're gonna, have relapses or like have
Right.
these bouts of
And
sin.
I think we discount a lot too the very reality of spiritual warfare within this world. Since the Enlightenment, we've talked about we can understand everything, we can analyze everything, we can figure everything out, and so psychology has taken the place of spirituality, spiritual direction. Like, and there's all these things that have taken place of the reality that there is a battle going on.
Yeah.
Greg Boyd he wrote a book called God at War. And his central thesis is that like Jesus entered into a battleground. And that was one of his primary calls, was to enter into this battleground and let you know that the reality of this battle that's been going on for all time is very present and very real and happening. And a lot of what you see him doing is battle against those spiritual forces. It's like, that the scene in I think it's in John, I may be wrong, maybe Luke, but Jesus and the disciples are walking down the path, and the disciples see a man who's born blind, and they go, "Oh, who sinned here? Was it him or his parents?" And I can almost see Jesus being so like, why would you even have that? Neither. This is so the glory of God can be shown, the power of God over these forces can be shown. And there's a very real thing, like if you are on that stage, on that platform, like you have a target on your back.
Yeah.
He's coming after you.
Yeah.
It's very real.
Yeah.
One of the things that's fascinating to me about the current age that we live in is how accelerated the optimization of systems has become. And so I'm sitting here trying to piece these pieces together. But somebody who refuses to allow themselves to be the savior of other people will naturally limit their influence. You're very unlikely to become a mega celebrity if you don't allow yourself to be somebody else's answer.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening then is that you have this friction by which those people kind of get pushed downward. And then of the people who are willing at some point in their life to become the answer for other people, I will be your savior, I will be your role model, I will be your guru, I will be your, then you enter into this self-reinforcing system. And it's like, it's just this feedback loop. The more that they give, the more you give back, the more they give, the more you give back, they're accumulating mass, numbers, all these things. And it to me, it's almost like, I mean, if we didn't have the internet, if we didn't have the printing press, um, you would be reliant on one person in a specific region, and maybe you could have some of this in a smaller degree, but the acceleration, that's what I mean by the acceleration, like this feedback loop gets accelerated,
Does.
and you find one person somewhere who can meet this need for people, and all of a sudden this thing really can accelerate very quickly.
Right.
Right.
And then as soon as they become flawed in some way, we've got to all shoot them down. Like, like you see it a lot with like the stars or, even great preachers, whatever, anybody who's
Yeah.
famous for whatever reason, as soon as they make a flaw to their audience that they see, like, you got to shoot them down and look for the next hope, right? Look for the next one that's
Yeah.
gonna be the one to kind of carry the gauntlet from there.
Yeah.
Sure.
Which is so sad that like the thing that could really help us in community is the thing that nobody wants to endure, especially as a leader, right? Like, but it's like, yeah, we need that vulnerability. We need to keep ourselves in check. We need to help everyone else keep themselves in check, to be realistic about the situation of like, no one is perfect here and we are struggling, and yet we still want to be vulnerable and we still want to love one another despite those issues or those struggles. And how can we come alongside you to walk with you through this, right? Like, it's like,
Right.
I'll be the one, this is my turn to kind of help you through, and then I'm going to need your help later, like, but we don't want to have to admit to that. Like, it's hard and it's frustrating, but it's like those are the best communities to be a part of, like, in that. Yeah, that's that's the goal. So you don't want to be the one up there being perfect, like.
Yeah. And I mean, so I think a lot of this for many of the people who I'm speaking against, or not speaking against, I'm very careful to like, I want to use the same language Paul used of like, the gospel's being preached, whether even if it's from bad motives, the gospel is being preached. Because I see many people who aren't overtly doing something to corrupt the gospel itself. And maybe they're in ill intention. Like you said, by rising to the top, you have to wonder what choices they did make that allow themselves to do that, because you do have to make those choices. And yet the gospel is being preached. And I think part of the blessing of that is that it is a numbers game, right? Like if there is a small if there's a pastor who's prioritizing not being the savior, prioritizing community and vulnerability, they're not going to reach millions of people. And so it almost like you have those who are casting the seed far and wide, and you have those who are actually going and tilling the soil and tending the plants. And I'm okay with there being different roles. I think ideally, yeah, you would still say there are many more workers that could be utilized than just being propping up these celebrities. And so I would still say there's imbalances we can fix. But also I'm I want to be careful to say like, oh yeah, there are baptisms being happening. I think those baptisms are valid. I think there's people being saved, and I think there are people being discipled. And I listen to some of these preachers who do have wide influence, and I gain, fruit and health from some of the things that they say. And so I think there is a balance between like ideal and what we're striving for in a close-knit community, and maybe some of the influence and things that are happening, and still thanking God for the reach. Um, Even
Yeah.
the New Testament church, so I had a professor who was big on emphasizing the difference between the city church and the house church. And he really saw like the letters themselves as being symbols of this. I mean, Paul's writing to the church in Corinth, but there were many house churches in Corinth that were meeting. And so there's a sense in which the city church would come together as a whole, much like a megachurch might look like, but then would meet in house churches on a regular basis. So it seems like
Yeah.
that model was prevalent in the New Testament church, and had a way of unifying the whole city and the movement of mission in the city, but as well as, creating those small knit communities. And so I think, yeah, I'm perfectly fine for the church to have a big presence. Um,
Yeah.
so small communities that they can find within that.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that's also part of like the work of Satan too, is to have that big leader, whatever. And even if, they're trying to be a great example of Christ, as soon as they mess up, everyone, aims to shoot him down. But then we don't walk through the process of forgiveness with them, right? We don't walk through the process
Right.
of them asking, for reconciliation. And like that's a strong part of the gospel. And so like I think that cutting it off right there is a good way for, Satan or whatever to just,
Right.
kill that and not allow it to be the beautiful thing that it is. Because even I love Hamilton and I'll like watch it over and over. It's so fun, whatever. But one of my favorite parts is the song that the wife sings, and that they're all singing about forgiveness, and that
Mm.
she chose to forgive him. And it was like such a beautiful, moving thing, because it's like I don't often see that in popular movies or shows, or that to be, especially like, he cheated, good riddance, bye. Like that's a lot of what you see in media.
Retribution.
Right.
Exactly. Like
Right.
get even,
Yeah.
get mad.
Get your pound of flesh and
Exactly.
move
And
on.
do away with him, right?
Yeah.
But it's like the fact that they chose to praise it and to frame it in that way
Sure.
was,
Yeah.
because it's like, and everyone felt how powerful that was, because it was just like a very tearful moment. And you're just like, man, like that is part of the beauty of the gospel, is
Yeah.
about forgiveness. It's all about that relationship being made whole again. And so that is one of the strongest messages, right? Like that's what we're trying for, is to be back in relationship with God. And we have been forgiven through Christ's work. And so it's, you know, I think if we were, to experience more situations like that, where leaders were then able to have a very public of like, I need your forgiveness, and I
Right.
want to make this right. And I know I'm still flawed, but like that would be huge. And so, yeah, it makes sense that it's
Right.
a certain kind of, mission that he wouldn't want to have heard. Right.
Right. Well, and we have a model for it, right? In Matthew 18, we have a model,
Mhm.
but the model has been corrupted.
Mhm.
If you go and look at it, Jesus says, if you have a problem with your brother, go to him directly and have the conversation. And if he listens to you, you've
Right.
regained a brother. Doesn't say agree, says
Yeah.
listen. And then if you won't listen, bring two more. Okay. He still doesn't listen, then get, elders involved, something like that. To me, what I see happening there is it's a very small circle, and it's very relational, and it's about knowing and being known.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that what it looks like in our current model?
Yeah. Really.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, at least in my experience, I'm not saying mine is everybody's. It's not what it looks like in the current model,
Right.
Yeah. Sure.
especially within culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's not
I
done in
mean,
a way, right? It's not seeking out their good
Sure.
necessarily, right? Like it's trying to
right.
save face and trying to make
Mhm.
sure our ministry doesn't fall with that, and trying to distance ourselves from it, rather than trying to care for them in their time of need and to walk with them through the struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough one. And I mean, it takes a lot of strength to enter into those conversations and want to listen.
Yeah.
I mean, especially if you've been hurt. I get it. Like it takes a lot of strength, but we are absolutely commanded to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
just get to wash our hands of that rule and, put it on the shelf.
It's uncomfortable.
If we imagine ourselves in those shoes and we talk about the shame that we feel even in small groups of people around self-disclosure, but can you imagine having that multiplied many times over, and then also having the most vocal people be able to find their way to your doorstep, and um, and also, can you imagine the ask after you've been the one who's carried the weight for so long to accept somebody else's long-term commitment, because this is anything but an overnight process. This is a possibly the rest of your life journey of unpacking everything that your whole life. And so to go from that level of self-sufficiency, or not self-sufficiency, but that level of support to needing, to being so vulnerable and needing somebody else to dedicate that much of their time to know and to be known, to walk through that process. I mean, it, to me, putting myself in those shoes, that's an incredibly challenging position to find yourself in.
In my experience going through something like that, with those I've worked with and myself, you're walking through the valley of the shadow of death for at least 2 years. At least. Now imagine that. 2 years of that. And yes, the shepherd is with me, the rod and the staff they comfort me.
Right.
But if there's a correction, if there's repentance, if there like that is a painful process. And I think it's, at least in my experience, it's gonna be at least 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
The pain of a soul walking through that for 2 years is
Yeah.
bad enough, even if they have community,
Yeah.
but alone, that's the destruction of a life.
That's right. Yeah. 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 This kind of goes back to that conversation though of like destroying in order to make whole, to make healthy, that it is 2 years and then the rest of your life, right? Like it's a couple years and then the rest of your life. So I think there's like a real there's a beauty in kind of maintaining hope that the ashes will become beautiful.
Right.
God will create something great. Um, but that doesn't lessen the pain of it. It doesn't lessen the destructive nature of it. It might actually increase it to know that God is fully refining and burning out all of it. Um, yeah, and it's
He
like
is an all-consuming fire.
it's all-consuming fire, and so there is this extra pain added to it. But then through it, then you actually find healing and wholeness
Yeah.
and freedom. And that's, yeah. Like, I think the hard part is about like prices you'll pay. Like, what is the price you'll pay for true freedom and restoration and wholeness? Um, and that's where the rock bottom comes in. Like, okay, I'm ready to pay that price.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even though it's on a smaller level, even with community, like what's the price you're going to pay for maybe having a little awkward conversation in your small group because of you're disclosing some hurt, some pain in your life, right? Like that's a price. You are paying a toll for walking on life's difficult struggle. And yet the freedom that comes from that, the healing that comes from that, it pays dividends.
Yeah. And certainly 1,000%, I believe that's how we become stronger and how we grow and how we move forward. I agree with you 1,000%. Um, but in the midst of the valley,
Yeah. It is
it's
hard.
hard to see that.
Yeah.
It's hard to see through. Yeah.
It's hard to see that. And that's why I think it's not easier, but it's a better experience if you have people who love you who are
Yeah.
walking through it with you.
And a
who
reminder.
can point you, this is going to be over.
Yeah,
There
yeah,
will be a time where you'll come out of this.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Because certain points, you're like, nope, I don't think I don't think I'm coming out of this.
yeah, right. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Well, and I was even thinking from the perspective of the, like in Matthew 18, of being the person who has to call the other person out. Like that's a painful job as well.
sure.
And
Yeah.
like that's
Oh yeah.
like, because you're also committing to that,
Yeah.
right? You know, walking
That
through the
process.
desert with them, and
Yeah.
you know, like that. If you're willing to call someone out on their stuff, that also assumes that you're willing to walk with them through the healing process, right? Like
Right.
Right.
to make
Yeah.
that relationship whole again, or whatever it was that they're struggling with. Like,
Yeah.
I think it almost assumes that you're going to be there to help carry that burden, right?
Right.
Because you were close enough into that situation to call them on it. And so I think that is also sometimes a deterrent for our strong community as well, because we know it's going to be long, it's going to be painful. I'm going to have to invest my time, my energy, my emotional energy, you know, like all of that
Yeah.
relationship. And I mean, like, even just thinking about, like, I have some relationships now that, like, you know, things went wrong and there was some, like, you know, spiritual abuse and leadership that did not go well, and yet there needs to be reconciliation. But even just thinking about that process is draining, and it comes with a whole bag of issues. And like I still feel the trauma and the, like, the anxiety that comes with even just thinking about trying to rekindle that relationship and to make it whole again. Um, I know it's something that has to come and should come, but man, it's daunting to even think about. And yet
Right.
that's also the price of solid community. And that's part of the,
Right.
like, I mean, this is also going to display Christ to both of us right through that process. But man, it's,
Yeah.
you know, so it's like things like that. It's not always a little slight or whatever. Like, you know, sometimes it's big stuff that really, you know, what's going to have to go into it. And so it's hard to buck up the courage to actually do it.
Right. And I wonder if some of, thank you for sharing that. It's powerful hearing you say it. I wonder if some of our anxiety is due to a sense of urgency we have around things.
Hmm.
Instead of giving space for God to move in everybody until everybody is ready to come back and have the conversation,
Right.
we want to accelerate this process. You know,
Right.
what if there's a natural process involved?
Yeah.
And can we allow space for that?
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's too, like, it's our, especially with, because I'm thinking about my own situation, like not knowing what's it going to look like. Am I going to know when it's time? Am I going to, you know, be aware and be confident then too, or am I going to have the same kind of anxiety? You know, like it's that unknown factor that makes it
Right.
difficult to not like go into those anxious, you know, because it's like I
Of
could just
course.
let this go for the rest of my life and try and throw it in the back burner, right? But like, but is that what's best? And you know, yeah, and it's like yeah, so it's, they still occasionally reach out, and so it's like this weird, like, it still brings stuff up and it's still coming back up. And so at what point am I going to choose to walk through the process, or am I in the wrong of not going there yet too? And I think
Right.
that's the hard part of, like, not knowing. And maybe it's something I do need to be more actively prayerful about too, you know, and that would probably be a huge indicator of you know, of like whether really
Yeah.
that anxiety, but also like letting me know of like, yeah, it seems like this is the time, or like, nope, it seems like this isn't the time, and letting God kind of define that for me.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's powerful. Yeah.
But yeah, it's messy.
Wow.
Relationships are messy, and we don't want them to be, but it's, you know, whether you're the one that's struggling or you know someone else is struggling, and you know you need to be the one to help them through it. Like we do, as I think people value our comfort and value, you know, the contentedness, which is a risky thing and a dangerous thing. Like,
Right.
it's okay to have seasons of rest, but you know, to kind of always be seeking after that, maybe that's not the goal. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think we very much dislike feeling in progress. We want it to be closed. We want to go from wounded to healed in a moment. I remember there's a beautiful definition of miracles is that it's just hurrying up a natural process that should or could take place on its own. And it's the picture of the water turning to wine, because Aquinas makes the point that water does turn to wine. Like rain falls, plants grow, grapes get crushed, and then the juice gets fermented, and there's wine, water to wine. Jesus just
Right.
the process. And I think
Yeah.
so much of our lives, we just want Jesus to turn water to wine.
Mm.
And we don't want to wait for the rain, go through the season of growth, get crushed, get pressed down. Then also going that into another season of waiting and allow that growth and process to ferment, if you will, in our souls before we're ready to be wine. We're so ready just to go from, I just want to be water to wine, water to wine. And we don't
Yeah.
process.
Right.
I remember being a kid and reading the book of Judges and thinking, ha ha ha, like you stupid people.
Sure, yeah, yeah.
Like you forget, like
Right.
what a bunch of dumb people you are.
Yeah, yeah.
Idiots.
Idiots.
How
Made
could you?
mistakes over and
How
over
could you?
after he just proved himself.
Yeah.
And then
Come
most of
on.
what I need to know on a daily basis is trust,
Sure.
wait,
Yeah.
rest, believe, lean into him. Like I'm the most, well, my wife will tell you, I'm the most forgetful person on the planet, probably, or competing for it. Uh, And
It's 7 billion ties.
It's
yes,
not enough.
Yeah. The 18 inches from the head to the heart, right? I think what
Oh,
David Ring, he was a speaker, a youth speaker growing up. He said that's the greatest distance is 18 inches from the head to the heart. That's the greatest distance in the world. Um, yeah, and I think one of the better articles I read on spiritual formation by John Coe, he wrote, and the title alone is pure gold. It's why do we sin when we know so much? I think
right.
it's kind of like, yeah, right. Like that's what I'm trying to answer. Like I
Right.
know, like it's not that I don't know. Like I know this is destructive and this is life-giving. I know God is trustworthy and I know, but
I know all these things.
yeah, but I still sin. So
Yeah. I like Carl Jung's definition of sin. He says, uh, neuroses, or loosely stated sin, is chasing after that which is not yours to have, or avoiding that which is yours to have, most often pain.
Mhm.
nice.
And I
Yeah.
think that's the distance, that's that 18 inches, right? I
Yeah.
know all these things. I know I can trust God. I know He loves me. I know all these things. But when the rubber meets the road
Yeah.
and I'm
Yeah.
scared,
Yeah.
Right.
what's the shortcut?
Yeah.
Right. And normally that's my own perfection, my own godlikeness. Like how can I be God? And
Right.
that's usually at the core of that thought too.
Yeah. One of my pastors was growing up, he did this analogy. It's like the plumber who goes just graduated plumbing school, his internship or whatever, and goes to Niagara Falls and goes, I can fix that.
Yeah,
No big deal.
that's
Yeah, I got this. No problem.
that's
Yes.
good. Yeah.
My closest friend, we I've known him for 30 years, and we were he was a vice principal and I was a teacher at a school, and that's how we got to know each other. And we laughed on this line over and over again. Like you tell somebody something and you're just like, I got it, no problem. Like
Yeah.
it's become our sarcastic response to life situation. I got it, no problem.
Don't even give it a second thought.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
By no measure do I have anything close to having this,
Right.
but I'm going to pretend like I do.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Oh
So
man.
I have a question I've been burning to ask. Like, this was we started this conversation a number of months ago, and we never got to finish it. And it kind of ties in with this question of sin and this question of all of this. And it comes down to this. I'm very curious how the perception, the understanding of sin and salvation has shifted in Western culture, especially in contrast to the understanding of the early, like the church fathers and those people. Um, I mean, we talk about some of the scapegoats and the even in the conversation today in the church, we hear a lot about the abusive nature of penal substitutionary atonement, and at least within certain segments of Christianity. And um, uh, Patrick, you had some thoughts, and I would love to. I mean, it's a rabbit trail I would love to chase if you're open to it.
I would love to as well. It's one of my favorite. It is one of my favorite topics too, and it's so funny because I was just picking up a book that really leads into it and sets a story for this whole movement. Um, so the interesting thing between the East and the West, is that the story begins with Paul and John. So in First Timothy, the end of First Timothy, Paul gives a benediction, and he says, to the all-wise God who dwells in unapproachable light, who no one has seen or will see. And it's this very bold proclamation of God's transcendence, his unknowability in his infinitude, all of this. And then in First John chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, John makes the statement like, we're God's children, what we are has not been revealed. But when we see him, we'll be like him because we will see him as he is. And so there's these very different streams of thought in terms of, okay, what is God's essence and can we know it and see it and behold it? And then that plays into then what is salvation? For the East, they pick up on Paul's stream where God is this kind of unknowable essence in himself. The only way we can know him is through analogy. Pseudo-Dionysius, he wrote a book called The Divine Names. So in the Divine Names, he says, okay, so what God does is he reveals himself in theophanies, and we say, oh, that's justice, or oh, that's love, that's mercy. And so we use these divine names for God, but we ourselves recognize these aren't his very essence, these are just who he's revealing himself to be. And so because we're so limited by humans, we can't actually know and understand, comprehend who God is in his essence. Um, and so what they move then into is the apophatic movement where they go, okay, well then we have to speak in the negative. So God's infinite, right? He's not finite, right? Even to the point where they would say, oh, God is not love, because I'm using the word love in the context of definitions that are flawed and human and based on human understanding. And God is not that. He's so much more perfect, so much infinitely greater than that conception of love. He's not love. He's something different that's altogether more perfect. And then from there they move into a space of silence where they stop using words altogether. And so
Right.
then deification or salvation for them is participating in God's essence, not necessarily in a knowledge way or in a comprehending way, but in a union way that's found through
Yeah.
mystery, the unknowing. The Cloud of Unknowing was a more famous book, anonymously written, where it's this kind of movement into silence where I let go of preconceived notions, let go of these things, where I become united with God in a not experiential in the terms of like I get feelings, but experiential in the terms of
No.
it's human, it's one-to-one contact, human relationship, it's union.
Franciscan.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit more Franciscan versus Dominican. So, and then then the West though, they would have picked up more on John's piece, where it is more comprehending, where they move into it, then they use seeing as this kind of comprehending, so this beatific vision, where we kind of behold God in truly his essence and who he is, and that transforms us and brings us into this kind of union with God that the East would want. But both of them had that thought of union and deification. And really deification, a lot of it comes from an idea of participation. So so the way of conceiving, and this was big for Augustine too, it's what kind of got him into the faith, was the conception of God is ultimate being, and from that flows being to everything else. So everything is in a hierarchy of being with God at the top. And the more or less you participate in that perfect being, the more or less life you have, if you will. And so
Right.
this kind of participation in God is this kind of ascent into greater participation with him. And so the gospel is really all about the incarnation. The incarnation is the key piece, because in the incarnation, you see in Hebrews, this is beautifully depicted. Christ ascends lower than the angels. So you have in Psalms, God created man, a little lower than the angels, crowned him with glory and honor. Jesus in the incarnation descends lower than the angels, taking on human flesh. And then by his human nature, he earns glorification by suffering. He learns obedience as a son, and he merits glorification. And so, thus, kind of raising human nature above angels, now seated at the right hand of the throne of the Father, and we're united with him in that. So, we're participating with Christ through his sacrifice, through his incarnation, then first through his incarnation, then through his sacrifice, then through his resurrection, then through his glorification into the life of God, where now we're united with God. Now, again, the East and the West have it different. The East is more focused on that deification as this kind of union with God that goes beyond comprehension, whereas the
Yeah.
West we kind of have this, you behold God and you're kind of brought in. But both are heavily focused on this idea of participation in the perfect being of God, where we become more perfectly united with existence itself. Who is God? It's a person, it's God. Um,
Yeah.
never erasing that distinction between creator and creature. It's always we never are assumed into God. We never become on the level of God, but we are then brought into this participation. And so the line looks like this. It's you start on the journey of deification, and you're going like this throughout your life, and then you die, and it takes a dramatic upcrease. Like you start, it like goes from like a 5-degree angle to like a whatever it may be, like a 85-degree angle, but it's still an angle. So even in heaven, you are ascending into God for all of eternity. It's this continual process of you entering into infinity, infinite perfect being, and that's what
Yeah.
heaven. And so the beauty of heaven is ascending one mountain peak, casting your eyes upon the view, and then seeing another mountain peak. And so you climb another little bit.
Right.
The hard switch was during the Protestant Reformation. So
Yep.
so Reformation was so linked with modern movement in philosophy and theology that what happened was it became a little bit more, the categories became very distinct. Now, many people probably disagree with me. This is my own take on it. So I'll put that little caveat out. It became so like you're justified at a moment,
Very rigid.
very rigid, justified in a moment, and then sanctification begins. Now that sanctification process does have some kind of level to it. It's kind of an extended process, but it's very short, because then you die, there's no purgatory. You're immediately perfected in heaven, and you're glorified in a moment, and that's it. So there's very distinct categories that begin to take shape versus the Eastern approach, and I would even say the older Western approach. It would be like justification is the process of beginning deification. And so it's
Yeah.
justification is happening as I begin to participate with Christ by denying myself, taking up my cross, and following him. That is the process by which I'm justified. Now, I'm justified by Christ's sacrifice, not my own works, or not by me winning in the process, going back to those categories of winning and losing, but simply by me participating in Christ. That's my
Yeah.
justification. And also included that in my sanctification. And then the West would introduce purgatory to talk about kind of that extended sanctification process. The Catholics, I would say, the Roman Catholics would introduce that. but then the Protestant, then I would say more modern move, which just happened to be the Protestant move, was just those bringing down of categories. So okay, now I'm saved. Even in more modern terms, I prayed the prayer. I'm justified. Justified is over. I don't have to worry about justification anymore. I'm already justified. Now I'm just worried about sanctification. I don't really know what that means, right?
Right.
Because what does that mean now? I mean, for the modern Christian, for sanctification and glorification to be such rigid categories, what does it actually mean to grow in Christ? Um, to do better, to act better. That's it, really. Now, if you think about the
Right.
Eastern approach, deification, sanctification, the Christian life, growing in deification would be me, and this is reflected in a lot of their practices, learning the words 100%. You learn theology, right? You don't have a silence of no words. You have a silence of exhausting words, and those are big differences of
Right.
silence. And so you exhaust your words, you go to a place of silence, and you seek to connect to God in a place of contemplation, meditation, where you let go. And this is seen through the Jesus prayer, through contemplative prayer, those sorts of movements.
Entering prayer.
Centering prayer, yeah. The Western church would then also have that reflection too, where it's like, oh no, there's a lot of more emphasis on theology, a lot more emphasis on this kind of participation in things that help you know God. So think of the sacraments, baptism being very important because you are identifying with Christ in a fully comprehensive, embodied way. The Eucharist, these emphases are focused on knowing God through comprehending the movements of salvation. Um,
Yeah.
and then again, reflected that in the modern church, you're like, oh, well, yeah, I guess I just read my Bible and I try to pray and I try to be good. Um,
Yeah.
and
I go
that's
to church. I have these rituals that I uphold.
I do some rituals, often lost fully the fully significance of these rituals. I mean, even a non-denominational Bible church will have deeply significant rituals.
Of
Think of
course.
Kevin Smith's book, Kingdom of oh man, is it Seeking the Kingdom? I think it's Seeking the Kingdom. He talks about some of the rituals, even in non-denominational churches, right? The standing to worship, the greeting time, the call to worship. Like these are all deeply beautiful rituals that bring us into a life of faith, but often
Mhm.
often lost on many of us.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I don't know if that was clear or helpful in thinking about deification. For sure, there are lines like the West for sure had a strain of Eastern thought come in, where there was some people who were adopting more of the Eastern thought of God's essence being distinct, but more of what was accepted was the Thomistic view of kind of you can know God in His essence when you see Him, kind of that beatific vision.
Right. Right. Yeah. So many thoughts.
Yeah, I just dumped a bunch of stuff because I've
No, it was
been like
great.
rolling this over ever since you talked about what we're talking about, and then I picked up this book on Aquinas and kind of the beatific vision specifically, just how the West and the East was different. I'm like, oh, yeah, it kind of blew my mind up.
Wow. Yeah. One thing, and then I actually have to sign off. And fully talk about this, but it strikes me as the outflow of the Renaissance, which the primary philosophy within the Renaissance was a Descartes who said, "I think, therefore I am." That concept has flooded through everything. It's all intellectual, and I see that tradition going into the West of "I think, therefore I am," and it I had a friend who ran a missionary organization, and he trained people to go into public schools and work within the public schools and share the gospel, all that kind of stuff. And he's an English guy, great guy, from Manchester. And he said what he noticed about Americans is they know the Bible really well intellectually,
Yeah.
but when it comes to the experience of it, completely and utterly lacking, or a situation where the experience of it was necessary, completely utterly lacking. And I see that an outflow from the Renaissance. I
Mm.
think, therefore I am. Well, and Nietzsche even says, like, yeah, God is dead because you killed him with your intellectualism.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and so he had some critiques of the church, which pretty accurate.
Yeah, you think God did that. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that outflow of the intellectualism, you know, robs you of the union experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there is a felt sense, and we're not talking about feelings, but a felt sense of the presence of God and the experience of Him in your life that cannot be intellectually understood or explained.
Yeah. Hmm.
We can also talk ourselves into inaction too, right? Like, because we get to these, you know, there are times, seasons for rest, and there are times for whatever, and you know, and like all these different things that we can then, you know, say, oh, but you know what, I think it's okay if I just hold back for right now, we'll do that later, or you know, whatever the reason, but like we can find ways to reason ourselves to not just do that right now, you know, and to make
Hmm.
not whatever, approach our neighbor for connection and maybe sharing the gospel with them because I've got to build a better relationship with them, but then we don't make an active effort to build that relationship, and so it never feels like the right time, whatever. Like there's lots
Right.
of ways we can
We
think.
can justify anything.
Exactly. Yeah.
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 Yeah. We're great at
Along
reasoning
with
ourselves and convincing ourselves.
along with idol creating machines, we're
Yep.
justification machines as well.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's Hattie's got nothing on us. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, so
This
here's
was a great conversation. I so thoroughly enjoyed this.
Yeah.
Would love to
Yeah.
have you back if you guys are interested.
Yeah, this has been great.
It's
This
been fun.
this is
Yeah.
what we love to do. So
Yeah.
yeah.
It's good. Yeah.
I think
Awesome.
this is perfect. I think this is an awesome cliffhanger. I mean, it's like let's just go up to the edge of really diving in even deeper, and let's just
Yeah.
shut the whole thing down.
Yeah.
Now you'll still have to come
It's
back and ask the
perfect.
question again.
Yeah.
It's great TV, right? You got the cliffhanger at the end of the season, and then like you're
Basically
now
24. Yeah. The
Yeah.
24. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah.
right. Oh, I love it.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you guys for joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
for letting-
Truly, thank you.
This is, yeah, a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So, closing out for all of you guys listening, if you guys made it to the end here, thank you for joining us on
Well
our
done.
journey. Yes, well done.
Yeah, right.
Ask us for a ribbon, we'll get you something. And be sure to subscribe, drop a comment on whatever platform. We'd love to hear from you, hear you guys' feedback. And until next time. All right, thank you guys.
Anytime.
Yeah.
Yeah.